Be January 30th, 2021. My name is Christopher Saunders, and this is the Connecticut Sports Talent Show, where we talk all things talents in Connecticut. But on today's show, we have a special guest who's outside the state of Connecticut, but news that does pertain as far as to the Connecticut side, as far as when we talk about high school football. The MIAA rather, from Massachusetts has allowed football to be played in the spring and also is planning on to play football in the fall as well. And I have someone who broke the story in Boston. His name is Matt Feld, and he's a Boston Herald sports writer. Matt, it's great to be able to have you on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate it.
First and foremost, before we get down to the nitty gritty, I just want to ask kind of how's your family doing and how are you doing as far as with this COVID situation?
Yeah, thankfully we've all been safe. As far as we know, throughout the pandemic, dating back to the beginning of last year. So thankfully we've all been able to stay safe. A couple scares here and there, but thankfully so far so good. And hopefully, as long as we continue to take the precautions that are necessary, it stays that way.
Now, as far as with you being a sports writer, and because obviously with sports at one point was paused and such, how did you get yourself through what was kind of in our eyes, because I'm a sports guy as well, broadcasts and so on and so forth. You kind of start figuring out like, okay, I got to start really kind of figuring things and try to produce content. So how did you do that?
Yeah, when sports first got shut down last March, we kind of went back to the well a little bit and I started to put together some all-decade teams. I found that to be great content, and people seem to love that stuff. We started with basketball, I think, and then went towards baseball and football, and then that went. And a couple of my colleagues then did sports like hockey and volleyball and track and swimming and diving. And so that really allowed us to kind of stay afloat for a couple months or so as kind of a high school sports writing group per se. We looked at some other NCAA athletes who had come home that were from the area that were being impacted by the fact that their seasons had been shut down and kind of how that impacted their eligibility. We looked at the Major League Baseball draft and how some local kids were kind of trying to stay in shape ahead of the draft that otherwise would have been finishing up their junior years of college. Some other minor league baseball players from around here who were trying to stay in shape in the event that the minor league baseball season ever started back up again, which obviously, it didn't by and large. So we kind of had to look at content that we otherwise probably would not have put out. But once we started looking, we realized that there were actually tons of great stories that we probably wouldn't usually tell that we had the chance to tell. And then once the fall came around, usually I cover football in the fall. Obviously, that did not take place here. So I was kind of outside my comfort zone a little bit. I started covering sports, particularly boys and girls soccer that I'd certainly covered before, but at a higher volume than I had in the past. So, which was also great, covering sports like soccer and field hockey, getting introduced to some of those communities, some of those coaches and players was awesome. And I got to see some terrific action. So you definitely have to be creative over the last 9 months or so in terms of covering sports or writing stories that I probably otherwise wouldn't have. But it was a great learning experience. And again, thankfully, everyone stayed safe, at least in my family side of things. And yeah, for the most part, there are people far worse off than I was trying to find stories to write over those couple months or so.
I feel like, man, kind of the way I've gone about since the pandemic started, and this is how this podcast even started, was I was not broadcasting because I broadcasted all over Connecticut, all the way through Boston, New York, so on and so forth. And I wasn't broadcasting. It's like, well, I'm the type of person that wants to keep on learning. I want to keep on trying. I want to, I love the conversations like with, like I'm having with you, with coaches and players and such. And I was like, well, if I can't talk to them physically during a game, well, there's this thing called Zoom and FaceTime. I can record it, and why not try it? And now it's become a hit. I feel like for you, being able to, like you mentioned, the all-decade teams and trying to keep touch with people who are, you mentioned the draft with Major League Baseball, so on and so forth. I feel like doing things like that kind of help not just the person you're talking to, but also yourself, because you're continuously trying to get better and capitalize on a situation, which is something we never could have predicted.
Yeah, absolutely. And also like reestablishing contacts, like reaching out to players that maybe I'd covered in the past. But as you said, writing stories, writing angles, again, and I'm usually probably not exposed to, particularly on the professional side of things when it came to, again, the draft or minor league baseball, how professional athletes were doing from this area that maybe I was writing stories on or interviewing, and again, typically was not exposed to that type of reporting since I'm mostly on the high school beat. So yeah, I really got a chance to be exposed and kind of embrace opportunities and get good experience, down avenues that I otherwise wouldn't be. And that's definitely something I'm very grateful for and thankful for. And I think hopefully as maybe a better writer and reporter going forward.
And I think the one story in particular, and the reason why I have you on, the MIAA breaking the news as far as they're playing with the fall 2 season, and more importantly, because of the fact of what's been going on in Connecticut, is on the football side, where Massachusetts will, at least as of right now, and that's the plan. And I know there's a lot of criteria things to it, and that's a reason why, another reason why I have you on to break it down, is they will allow football, contact football, not two-hand touch, not flag, but contact football to be played. But just tell me about kind of just give me the rundown. How did this all come about? Because I feel like, it started from plan A, and then there was a lot of plans after that.
Well, that's for sure. I mean, people were still preparing, and athletic directors that sat on the MIAA COVID-19 task force were still stressing the fact that schools had to be prepared for the chance that football would be played in the fall, as discussions amongst the task force and the state governments got more continuous throughout June and July and got more regular, while also knowing that the odds of football being played in the fall were pretty unlikely. The likes of myself, I know other athletic directors who had been in the meetings. I'm not in those meetings, but from what I'd heard, the odds of football being played in the fall here all along were by and large very unlikely. The only time that people around here thought that there was a chance of playing football in the fall was when it looked like Connecticut was going to be playing football in the fall, when that was first announced in July that the CIAC had developed a plan to play football in the fall. But other than that, there was really no reason to believe that football was going to happen here in the fall. It had been labeled a high-risk sport by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs throughout the summer, because of the fact that it's a constant contact sport that involves a lot of skin-to-skin contact and a lot of exchanging of respiratory droplets. So it was really no surprise when it was outlawed for competitions in the fall. Immediately, the MIAA and its task force developed an athletic calendar for the entire year that included a fourth wedge season between the winter and spring, and it placed football and other sports that cannot be placed in the fall into that season, because there's plenty of schools that didn't play sports at all in the fall, that opted on their own not to play soccer or field hockey or volleyball. And so if you were a school that elected not to play sports along with football, you could move those sports into the fall 2 season. And since that point, I think athletic directors who have been proactive have been scheduling for football and planning for football in that fall 2 season. And so as the months and weeks, kind of went by, and we got closer towards the end of November and early December, I think the first sign that the odds of football being played here really went up dramatically when basketball was allowed. I think when basketball was cleared and basketball was given the green light by the Secretary of Energy and the EEA to have a season, the odds of football went up dramatically. Now you were playing a sport indoors where kids were going up for rebounds, face guarding one another, playing heavy on-ball defense, face-to-face defense, just like you would probably be facing on an offensive and defensive line. I thought the odds of a football season being happening really went from being a possibility to being very likely when basketball and hockey were both allowed. And then honestly, in my opinion, based on what I was hearing the last couple of weeks, was kind of a formality. Coaches and athletic directors were sitting on the outside, kind of course, waiting to see what happened. But my understanding was that it would have been a pretty big shock come Friday if football had not been allowed. And in fact, kind of ironically, just like over the summer, the only time where people thought here there was a chance for football in the fall, the only time that I got the sense that people believed there was a chance that football wouldn't happen here in the fall 2 season was when Connecticut a couple of weeks ago announced that they weren't having football. And some people got worried that would maybe rub off on some people here as well. But that ended up not being the case. And the MIAA COVID task force, the MIAA football committee, the MIAA sports medicine committee all worked together to come up with modifications to recommend to the board of directors. And the board of directors discussed them yesterday for about an hour and finally approved them by a unanimous vote.
Now, you talk about as far as the task force and the constant communication. Here in Connecticut, it was the three amigos: CIAC, DPH, and then it was the Board of Education, and then the Board of Directors. Or so on and so forth. Now, as far as in Massachusetts, was there the DPH involved? Was there anything like that, or was it just kind of the people that you mentioned?
Well, one thing I will say is that the CIAC executive director seems to be very open with the media. Seems to be no problems talking to the media publicly. That is not really the case here. Unfortunately, a lot of the news here has to come through kind of the weeds, and you're kind of putting the pieces together. There's really no direct line of communication from anyone publicly at the MIAA. That's just the fact of the matter. And unfortunately, it's incredibly frustrating, not necessarily for me or my colleagues, but really for athletic directors who really need to have an understanding of what's going on. They're trying to put the pieces together based on information that other reporters are reporting, I'm reporting, what they're hearing from other athletic directors. Unfortunately, because you're kind of playing a game of telephone, by the time you finally get the information, it's not exactly always reliable. But I will say that the key parties here were the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, who, of course, was overseeing guidelines within schools, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which was overseeing recreation and youth sports guidelines, the COVID task force, which is comprised of about 22 athletic directors and principals from across Massachusetts. That task force was created towards the end of March to discuss ways that Massachusetts could reopen its high school athletic calendar year. And so they've been discussing things since last April, looking ahead to this past fall. And then, of course, the MIAA Board of Directors, which has the final say on anything that the COVID task force recommends. But the heads of the COVID task force have been meeting with the EEA and DESE rather continuously over the last 6 or 7 months or so. They've been in constant communication. They're going to continue communicating throughout the fall and spring season to make sure that MIAA sports are following the EEA guidelines as it pertains to modifications that have to be made, to make sure that kids and coaches are staying safe and following the state guidelines overall as it pertains to the proper health precautions that they should be following. The DPH is undoubtedly involved in these meetings, are epidemiologists, infectious disease doctors. Like I said, the MIAA Sports Medicine Committee is pretty heavily involved. So there's no question that they're involved, but I would say that the overall Department of Public Health involvement is more on the local level as boards of health assess from school district to school district what their individual schools should be doing based on the prevalence of COVID in their district.
Now, you mentioned about the fact of as far as the communication going on in the fall and such. I know in Connecticut, because I was here and I was covering it, that there was a lot of confusion as far as, one moment you're playing, next moment you're not. Now you're going to condition, then you're paused, then it's a no, then it's a maybe. It's like Madden, where you go here, and it's like, what. Was it like that in Massachusetts, or was it clear cut? This is what's happening. We're not changing our story, regardless of how many we get tweeted at, how many times getting called names.
So the MIAA Board of Directors has not made a decision that then they've changed their minds on later on once throughout this entire time. By the time the MIAA Board of Directors votes on something, it's pretty much going to be either we're doing this or we're doing that. There's been no changing of the mind. They certainly are more than their authority to do so. But by the time that a certain plan has reached their lap, so to speak, it's pretty much we're in a yes or no situation. Yes, we're playing football. No, we're not. Yes, we're playing basketball. No, we're not under these modifications. Now, one thing also that's different from Connecticut is that the governor in Connecticut's gotten very involved in high school sports. That's not been the case here. I don't know if Governor Baker has talked once about high school sports, certainly not in a press conference that's certainly only devoted to amateur sports. Maybe he's been asked at a press conference before. I watch a fair amount of Governor Baker's press conferences. I don't think he's ever been asked about high school sports. I think he's been asked indirectly about recreation and youth and reopening hockey rinks and things like that. But quite frankly, the governor has not shown publicly one iota of interest in high school sports. And quite frankly, I don't blame him. There's a lot more important things to be worrying about at the moment than high school sports. Lieutenant Governor has been pretty involved, but also not publicly. She's been in those meetings. She's given her 2 cents on how the state government feels at this moment in terms of what sports are acceptable, what kind of recreation youth activities are acceptable. But unlike Connecticut, the governor is really not in the way, either positively or negatively. The athletic directors, the principals, and again, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education have really taken the lead in being responsible for amateur athletics. The governor has pretty much diverted, the amateur sports responsibilities to those parties.
And through the process, as far as even when football was not going to be played, what was the communication like? Because I know, again, in Connecticut, I keep referring back, is that the coaches were kind of left, in some ways like a loop where they really didn't know what was going on. And then they find out at the 11th hour. Rather than, I'm not saying they weren't having communication with the athletic directors, but as far as, or their own athletic directors rather, but as far as with the head, they were trying to get answers and they couldn't get that. Were coaches and athletic directors in Massachusetts always in constant communication and everybody was on the same page?
No, I don't think so. I think it was kept pretty close to the vest. And again, even though I say that I thought over the last couple of weeks that playing football was a formality in all likelihood, or at least given the green light, there were still a lot of things that needed to be worked through. The sports medicine committee this past week finally met with the football committee over modifications. So, it wasn't like 3 or 4 weeks ago, those modifications have been improved. Those two parties met for 3 days. They had to work through a number of different issues with regards to social distancing on the sidelines, game day roster limits, water breaks, timeout breaks, whether the offensive and defensive line can really be so close together. So, yeah, in my opinion, it was a formality because of the way that things have been trending when it came to what athletics were being allowed, what sports were being allowed. But there was still a lot of work to do leading up to Friday, and then you have to vote. At the end of the day, you don't really know exactly how people are going to vote one way or the other. It ended up going the way it did. But there were still a number of issues to work through. So in terms of whether athletic directors were on the same page, I think there were a fair amount of athletic directors that were kind of out of the loop, weren't quite clear what was going on, where the discussions were at, who thought that there was probably a chance that we were never going to play football this year. In fact, I know for a fact that a number of athletic directors did not think that football would ever be approved this year. So I don't think everyone was on the same page, but I don't think it happened so publicly like it did in Connecticut. I think it was a little more under the rug, under the table than maybe what was going on in the Nutmeg State.
I kind of feel like that may have been, and again, maybe, hindsight's 2020, playing Monday morning quarterback here.
Sure.
But I feel like the approach that Massachusetts had was probably a better one, because a lot of news as far as in Connecticut, and maybe I'm wrong, this doesn't happen in other places, who knows? But in Connecticut, there was a lot of leaks. There was a lot of information
Sure.
out prior to when a decision was made. And
Sure.
It kind of seemed like it either altered the decision or it pushed the decision back farther. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like the approach of Massachusetts was a proper one because, like you said, kept it to the vest. You kind of had to piece things together, but nothing was truly leaked, and it kind of allowed for less media attention. Whereas in Connecticut, we had a bunch of rallies, marches, whatever you want to call them. I mean, there was one at the Capitol, and a lot of the players had them. I'm sure you guys saw them as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think here the decisions have been also a lot more localized. So even if states are necessarily making, even if the state overall is allowing football, just like the state overall is allowing basketball, you're going to have individual districts that decide not to play those sports. So I think the decision to play athletics has been way more delegated to individual districts. All right, this is where this is the prevalence of COVID in your district. The Board of Health can decide, you shouldn't be playing sports right now. Or maybe you're conversely on the other end. You're in a green district, which in Mass means that, I think you're below 2 or 3% positivity per, 100,000 people, or, whatever the metrics are that the DPH uses. You're a fine spot to have athletics. So I feel like in other states, maybe it's been kind of an all or one approach, an all or none approach. Here in Massachusetts, that really hasn't been the case. Again, I will say for sure, the task force and the sports medicine committees and the respective sports committees have done great work. I do appreciate, and I know many people appreciate, the fact that Connecticut at least is way more open and transparent with the media and athletic directors in terms of what's going on. You're right, there are a lot more leaks for sure. There are a lot more leaks from the governor's office, the CIAC, coaches, as opposed to their opinion and perspective on things. But they are, at the end of the day, when decisions are made, coming before the media and answering questions. And the fact is that really has not happened here. But you're right. There certainly have been a lot less leaks here with regards to what specific modifications are coming. Those have been kept on the very down low. I'd heard of a couple leading into Friday's meeting, but really did not get most of them until right before they were going to vote as the meeting was going on. And so for the most part, they have been very, very good at keeping things close to the vest. I think the big thing with that is having people on the task force that are responsible, that put the best interest of athletics first, know how important it is to keep information quiet. And the fact is all along that athletic directors and principals here have been watching other states to see what works and hasn't worked. They've been doing that since June. They were very open that they would be doing that. That's one of the big reasons football also didn't happen here in the fall, is the fact that they wanted to see how it worked in other states, to see whether or not there was a safe way to do it, and then maybe copy some of the modifications that other states made so that we could have a successful fall 2 season here. So I think by and large, the people that have been responsible for making sure athletics happen this year, those 22 individuals, and certainly the 2 or 3 that are leading the group, have done a great job in ensuring that the proper information gets out when it needs to get out. And overall, they've been instrumental in making sure that kids have the opportunity to compete this year.
And as far as going back to the fall again, as with the football players, coaches, et cetera, what was the temperament? What was the, were they satisfied as far as knowing the decision, or because in Connecticut, like I mentioned, They were dragged through the mud. So
Sure.
many issues. I mean, coaches are still angry now. Players are still angry now.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand that Massachusetts, as far as football for right now, will be played, and they are probably
Sure.
extremely excited and so on. But what were they like in the fall? Were they as angry as Connecticut was, or were they a lot more even keeled?
They were certainly upset. Unfortunately, I don't know. I still don't think people know where to divert their anger at. The MIAA is simply not responsible for what sports can and can't be played here, or what sports are deemed safe, I should say. That's up to the EEA to determine whether or not sports can get played or not. So when football was designated as high risk in August by the EEA, and as a result could not have competitions, there was nothing the MIA could do at that point. The MIA could have voted 22-0 to have an MIA football season in the fall. Wouldn't have made a difference. Football was simply not allowed by the state government. And I don't think that people were as angry. I think people were certainly upset and certainly angry that there was no fall football season, particularly because at the time, overall, Massachusetts' COVID numbers were pretty good. But I think people were also not overly surprised because there was never a point over the summer where the MIA had announced a fall season football plan. They drafted one. There had never ones that had been released. I think all along, deep down, people knew it was incredibly unlikely that we weren't going to have a fall football season because of the fact that because there had never been any public information to suggest otherwise. And again, unlike Connecticut, where it seemed like for a little bit in July that they had drafted a fall football season proposal, that had never happened here. The MIA was not going to act on the drafting of a fall football schedule that undoubtedly would have been modified by the time the season got started until they got the green light from the state to play football. And since they never got that, there was never really discussion. So yeah, people were certainly angry and upset. And I think at that point had been kind of became fatalistic over the chances of football happening at any point this year. But I certainly don't think there was the same anger that there was in Connecticut because people were never told otherwise than the fact that the odds of playing football in the fall are very unlikely.
The one danger that Connecticut has, and I praise them as far as at least having a plan, having something, but knowing that it was going to be modified, like you mentioned, at some point. But the
Yep.
one thing that really hurt Connecticut and has angered a lot of people on the football side here is that there was this quote unquote promise that there was going to be a football season in the spring, the fall to whatever you like to call it here. But now we know that's not going to happen. And now more people are angry by that. So I almost feel like that because of what Massachusetts did, not putting out something 2 months, 3 months ahead, and then having to, we got to reel that back in because now we got to change it. I feel like that's the much better approach because then at least okay, this is where we stand. We're not moving. End of story.
It's exactly right. This is, again, the MIA has always made sure to announce plans after the EEA. All right. It has announced whether or not high risk, moderate risk, low risk sports can compete. And so the MIA has never been the one to jump ahead first. And again, I don't know for sure if I'm accurate with this, but I just feel like following Connecticut, the CIA seems to have their plan. It then goes to the Board of Control. And then the governor seems to be coming in afterwards and saying whether or not that plan is okay or not. And that just seems totally backwards to me. The governor should be coming out and saying what's allowed, and then the CIAC and their executive board should be working based on what the governor says is allowed to develop a season plan. So if the governor says that you can play 7 football games, then the CIAC and the Board of Control work to create a schedule with modifications that allow 7 football games. But I don't know why you're doing all the work only to then be shot down by the governor of what you can and can't do. That just seems totally backwards to me. The state associations and athletics work for schools and work for the state at the end of the day. So athletics in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, are in school systems. They're not their own entity. And so they're told by school systems, by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and the governor what is allowed and what isn't allowed. It's not the other way around. And so to me, you should be waiting to hear from your governor, away from your state, authorities, your state health authorities on what sports are safe to play, how you can play them. And then the state athletic association should be doing the work to see to it that they can give the kids an athletic experience within those state guidelines.
Yeah, no, great points all around, man. I totally agree with you 100% there. Another question I have for you, as far as you mentioned earlier, the districts, as far as in the red, in the green, red meaning high positive rate, probably can't play any sports. Green means no, you can play, just kind of like red means stop, green means go. I found that to be kind of funny. Was there ever a discussion, to your knowledge, as far as, because I know maybe about a month ago, I could be wrong, that Game Time, which I don't know if you know, but covers Connecticut sports, does a fantastic job. they did a survey about with, I think it was athletic directors that did get back to them as far as would you play sports if school was, remote, or would you still play if it was hybrid, which is half at
Yep.
home and so on. I think it was 40%, basically, give or take, where it was, yes, we'd play sports if we're in the hybrid model. 40% said, no, we would not play if we are not in school. And then the other half said, if we're not in school, we'll practice, or so on and so forth. So was there any discussion as far as with the schools, with the model that I just brought up?
Yeah, so schools, again, that decision has really been delegated and localized. So if you're remote, you can still play athletics. That at first was a little hazy when DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, first released their guidelines for having athletics back in August. Those guidelines were a little blurry on whether or not you could be remote and still do athletics, but they quickly reversed course on that. And so it's up to each individual district to decide whether or not, if they're fully remote, whether they want to have athletics or not. There are plenty of districts in the fall that will fully remote and still play sports. There are districts that go in and out from being remote to hybrid that still play sports. There are some schools that, when they have to go remote for a week or two, shut down athletics as well. So it's totally up to each individual school district how they want to handle that situation on whether or not they still want to have athletics when they're remote or hybrid or not.
Now, as far as looking at the football season itself, now, according to what I read in the article yesterday that was published, that they are going to start February 22nd all the way through April 25th. Now, what I thought was intriguing was this 15 practices needed in order to participate, and that the season could start late, according to the EEA, because they want to make sure that everybody is obviously physically ready, mentally, so on and so forth. So just kind of break that down for me, because I know in Connecticut, as far as during the winter sports, it was 10 practices for basketball in order to begin, some meaning longer because of COVID and not being in school. So just talk to me about that.
Yeah, so there is a little more time given to football, and there's a little more time given to football in the fall as well. They actually have 3 extra days of practice on the back end at the start of the season that other fall sports do, because of the fact that due to the tackling and due to the physicality, kids need an extra 3 days in order to be ready for in-game competition. So that's actually always been the case by and large with the rules. And so that's going to be no different in this fall 2 season. You do need 15 practices before you can compete. And again, that's just to make sure that kids are prepared for the physicality when Fridays and Saturdays rolls around. So the big thing is going to be with the weather. Obviously, it is going to be absolutely freezing. And at this point, the EEA is not allowing any indoor practices for football teams of any kind, whether those practices indoors involve contact or not. There's a chance that that rule could get changed. The leaders of the MIAA COVID task force are meeting with the EEA over the next week to see if there can be kind of some rewording of the language, so at the very least kids can maybe work out inside, or do pass skelly and offensive and defensive drills that don't involve contact. But at this point, you're not allowed to go inside and have football practice. So right now you need 15 outdoor practices before you can play your first game. Which means when you line up with it, it means that you start that first Monday, and if you're able to go outside, you practice those first, you get those, I think there's 18 days between the first Monday and the first Friday night. And that means you get 1 off day each week, which is what you'd be getting anyway. And you get your 15, 16 days before you're ready to play on that Friday or Saturday. The big thing is going to be the weather, though. And if the weather holds up, that should not be a huge issue for teams. If the weather does not hold up, then you're right. There probably is going to have to be a short delay, not to the season itself, but until teams can play their first game.
Now, as far as how is that going to affect the spring, as far as, because I know in Connecticut, again, the executive director of the CIAC, Glenn Lungarini, who I've had on the show, and he was a great guest to be able to have on, gave a lot of information. He talked about the reason for not allowing football to be played and, so on and so forth was because of, he came out with a number, 38% of the athletes play a spring sport, and he didn't want to force them to choose. So if the season is pushed because of COVID, weather, or both, how is that going to be delegated?
The season's not going to be pushed. So I'm going to answer your question by rejecting the premise. There's no situation in which the season's going to be pushed. The spring season's going to start on April 26th. It's going to go until at most July 3rd. There are no circumstances in which the MIAA will revert and move the football season into the spring season. Now, what the MIAA has done, and they've done that since the beginning of fall, is that schools can manipulate their athletic calendars any way they want. So if schools want to move football into the spring, they don't want to play it during the fall 2 season, they have to ask their district athletic committees that oversee, a certain amount of overall school communities and get approval for that. But the MIAA, under no circumstances at all, is going to extend the football season. They're not moving football into the spring season. It's never been discussed. It was never considered. And so no spring athletes have to worry about that, because that's not going to be something that's ever on the table.
I'm happy to say this, and people can say if I'm wrong here, but it's great to be able to hear a plan that's going to stay as a plan and
Yeah.
not move and not be pushed down the road, kicking the can down the road. It's nice to hear that. This is what we're doing. I don't care what we're going to get, the backlash. It's going to stay right here, man. That's fantastic to hear. I want to go over the modifications,
Sure.
with you, because I thought some of them were pretty, this one in particular, and trust me, there's been days where I've sat with my notebook and I'm just writing ideas like, okay, how can we modify football? And some of them are a little quirky. And I thought, hey, you know what? It's COVID. Who knows? This might happen. But this one I found interesting. No huddles, which, I mean, we see that already in college and pro football, especially in the Big 12 and such. But players will face in the same direction, but with spacing. So I almost feel like, is the quarterback going to have to like somewhat yell? And then if he yells, the opposing team's going to hear it. That, I don't know, that seems kind of funny, but like in a cool way to me.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of funky. It's kind of like with basketball, with the fact that huddles are so spaced out this year, and the fact that there's no parents in the gym. Pretty much every team can hear what the other team is talking about in their huddle. It's really not a huddle. You might as well just be calling it out on the court. So it's certainly very unique. They're trying to limit the face-to-face interaction on the field as much as possible. And so huddles are definitely very discouraged. It's encouraged that coaches call out plays from the sideline to the quarterback. The quarterback does not run over, get the play from the coach, and then run back out. It's encouraged that the coach call out the play, via wristband, obviously, that the quarterbacks have and are wearing at all times. It's certainly going to be very quirky, the fact that they all have to face the same direction. It's definitely going to be very interesting. I think you're going to have a lot of times where teams are simply just running up to the line and calling plays right at the line of scrimmage, just like a lot of college teams do now, as you said. And I certainly think as a result, you'll probably see a lot more fast-paced up and down games than you usually do. You won't be able to necessarily see teams huddle up for 20, 25 seconds before getting up to the line.
I also found it interesting as far as the full contact drills, 30 minutes per week if there's a game scheduled, 45 if a game is not scheduled. I know full contact was one of the biggest issues, and even to this day, it still is as far as with high school football in Connecticut, because like you alluded to when we first started this podcast episode, because of the respiratory droplets and skin to skin contact and so on and so forth. Was that as far as a modification? Because I feel like the rest of these are great, but I feel like the full contact one was one of the biggest hurdles because of what I just alluded to.
Yeah, so one of the reasons there's not a lot of in-game modifications in terms of actually changing the game itself to football is because the MIAA Sports Medicine Committee concluded with the MIAA Football Committee is that by being a tackle sport, there's really nothing that you can do to slightly alter the game of football without drastically altering the game of football. So if you take out the tackling, it's no longer football. It's now flag football or 7-on-7 football. And so ultimately the determination was made was that if we're going to play this sport, we have to have tackling involved. And since we have tackling involved, there are very few other in-game modifications that we can make that are going to make a difference. Because once the kids start tackling each other, because the sport is inherently a contact sport, there's really not much else that we can do to limit exposure or limit probability of transmission from someone else to another if COVID is unfortunately prevalent on the field. So that was, to me, was the big thing, is that once the Sports Medicine Committee and the Football Committee agree that there was a way to play this sport, they came to the acceptance that because it's a tackle sport, there's really nothing else that we can do to impact the game in-game that's going to make the game any safer. And so they accepted that it's a tackle sport. There's going to be a lot of constant contact. The EEA has allowed us to have constant contact outside now, dating back to the beginning of December, end of November. So we might as well play this sport. And since there's tackling involved, there's really not a lot of other in-game changes that we can make.
Was there any pushback as far as with the full contact? Because again, as I just mentioned not too long ago, was that was one of the biggest issues in Connecticut because, and I must have heard this at least 8,000 times, respiratory droplets, contact, face-to-face, and then so on and so forth. Was there ever any pushback from anybody, either within the athletic department or you talk about the sports medicine side? Was there ever any sort of conflict?
Certainly there were comments that were made raising concern, but again, the state has cleared the sport for play. And so if the state government and the EEA, in working with epidemiologists, infectious disease doctors, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, the lieutenant governor has determined in a public document that's available on mass.gov that the sport is safe enough to play with certain modifications, since it's constant contact, but outside, the key thing being that it's outside, that there really is not many other things that the sports medicine committee can say because of the fact, or the football committee or other athletic directors. The state has decided that it's safe to play, despite the fact that there's a lot of contact going on. And so at that point, you have to find a way to play the game.
Matt, honestly, so great to be able to have you on. I could talk to you for 3 hours about this, but we're just about run out of time. But thank you so much for being able to come on, man, being able to talk about these hot button issues that, I mean, Massachusetts doesn't have many. Connecticut, come on by because we got them all. But man, it's great to be able to have you on, and hopefully you'll come back on in the near future because you were fantastic.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it. Connecticut's blessed to have some great sports reporters like Sean McFarland, who's actually from the Globe up here, who I've gotten to know, who's been covering this from the start. So I hope everything works out there. I know that football is not necessarily gone the way that student athletes and coaches hoped for, but hopefully that each kid finds a way to participate somehow in extracurricular activities down there the rest of the way. And I hope everyone down there stays safe.
That'll wrap things up in the Connecticut Sports Talent Show. So until next time, stay safe. Remember, CT stands for Connecticut Talent, and I'm on a journey to find them all. Have a good one, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.